On the morning of December 8, 1941, Franklin Roosevelt delivered a message that was intentionally compact and built for speed. It fixed the shock of the previous day to a specific date, turned the chronology of events into public evidence, and translated outrage into lawful, coordinated action. The architecture was classical and exordium that placed the audience in a shared moment, a telegraphic narrative of facts, a confirmation drawing legal and moral inferences, a concise request to Congress, and a concluding pledge, and each part mapped to the practical needs of a nation about to mobilize. The opening sentence created a civic timestamp rather than a rhetorical flourish, and the choice of a single hard word, infamy, did the moral work in one stroke. That choice was deliberate. In the night's drafting, broader phrases gave way to a clean predicate that jurists, newspaper editors, and shop foremen could all repeat without embroidery. The narrative that followed was built to sound like a situation report. Instead of an emotional catalog of suffering, Roosevelt stacked short, active clauses and reused the same lead-in to point again and again at simultaneous blows. Not only Pearl Harbor, but Malaya, Hong Kong, Guam, the Philippines, Wake, Midway. The repetition functioned as audible cartography. It conveyed scale without statistics and, by implication, planning without accusations. American listeners did not need a seminar on deception. The morning papers were already reporting that Japanese envoys had been delivering a long memorandum to Secretary of State Cordell Hull after bombs were falling, a delay born partly of encryption and typing bottlenecks inside the embassy. The collision of diplomatic ceremony and torpedo tracks spoke for itself. Roosevelt's structure elevated that calendar fact into a legal inference. Hostilities existed. Diplomacy had been a screen. Therefore, the United States would take the step that matched the reality. The request to Congress took only a line. He asked for a declaration of war. No catalog of wrongs, no legal brief. The logic remained chronological. The date established the injury, the map list established the scope and intent, the inference established necessity, and the request made the political mechanism move. The Senate voted 82-0, the House 388-1, with Jeanette Rankin casting the lone dissent. The votes reflected a country that had awakened to the sight of burning ships, but the speech supplied something the flames could not. A grammar that linked the anger of citizens to the levers of government, industry, and command. His peroration paired morality with capacity, righteous might, and that pairing became a quiet order for factories, shipyards, and training fields. What made the address unusually effective as a mobilization instrument was the way it nested inside earlier preparations without requiring a reinvention of purpose. The defense buildup of 1940-1941 had already created rails, the Selective Training and Service Act of September 1940, the Two-Ocean Navy Act of July 1940, the Lend-Lease Framework of March 1941, the National Defense Advisory Commission, then the Office of Production Management in January 1941, the Supply Priorities and Allocations Board in August 1941, the Office of Scientific Research and Development under Vannevar Bush. These bodies and laws had created plans, tooling contracts, and partial conversion schedules. What the December 8th address did was fuse them into a single axis. Within 10 days, the first War Powers Act, December 18, 1941, authorized executive reorganization and accelerated contracting. The Office of Censorship, December 19th, defined the boundaries of information discipline in a democracy at war. The Office of Defense Transportation, December 18th, centralized rail and highway priorities. The War Shipping Administration, February 7, 1942, took control of merchant tonnage. In mid-January 1942, The War Production Board replaced OPM and SPAB, acquired the power to set priorities and allocations, and began issuing the rating systems that decided which plant received a machine tool and when. In March 1942, the Second War Powers Act expanded those powers, loosened procurement rules, and gave administrators the legal reach to interrupt civilian markets in the service of strategic needs. The speech did not write these statutes, but it gave them a common warrant, not a program in search of a purpose, but a recorded wrong calling forth a sequence of measures. At sea, the address helped resolve ambiguities that doctrine had left unsettled. On December 7th or 8th, Pacific Fleet submarines received orders that effectively began unrestricted warfare against Japanese commerce. The decision carried strategic and legal weight. Roosevelt's chronology negotiations on the surface, planning beneath. Hostilities now gave commanders and lawyers the argument they needed to focus on logistics as a lawful and necessary target set. The command changes that followed in late December placed the fleet in hands that would prosecute a carrier-led war and a submarine tonnage war simultaneously. Ernest J. King, first as Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Fleet, Cummins, then combined with Chief of Naval Operations, and Chester W. Nimitz as Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet. Doctrine leapt from texts to operations, early 1942 raids, the adoption of task force structures, the acceleration of damage control training that Pearl Harbor's fires had already made urgent. Industrial conversion moved from negotiation to execution. Detroit had experimented with defense contracts through 1941. After the speech, the final civilian automobiles rolled off lines by early 1942, and entire plants began retooling for aircraft, tanks, and engines. The Willow Run complex scaled B-24 production in a way that forced new thinking about fixtures, jigs, and process flow. Tool and die shops across the Midwest received priority ratings that pulled scarce lathes and milling machines away from consumer goods. Aluminum, copper, and critical alloying elements were reallocated on tables issued by the War Production Board. The Office of Price Administration moved from planning to enforcement as ceilings and rationing took hold, sugar in 1942, gasoline soon after, meat and other commodities in 1943. The War Manpower Commission, created in April 1942, arbitrated the distribution of workers among the draft, industry, and agriculture so that combat units and critical factories would not cannibalize each other. Each of these administrative shifts drew oxygen from the same rhetorical fire. If a state of war existed as the default condition, then priority, allocation, rationing, and conversion could be presented not as experiments or fads, but as the only coherent way to behave. Numbers would later dramatize the transformation: aircraft in the hundreds of thousands, merchant hulls in the thousands, escorts and destroyer escorts in the hundreds. But behind the totals were specific changes that the speech's simplicity helped sell. Liberty ships, standardized for speed of build, moved from craft practice to prefabrication and welding. The publicity stunt record of assembling one in under 5 days dramatized a deeper reality. Cycle times fell because design families stabilized and inspection regimes tightened. Destroyer escorts, unshowy but essential, were authorized in blocks that reflected a world in which convoy protection was not a theoretical Atlantic issue, but a global requirement that also touched the Pacific. Escort carriers, converted and purpose-built, appeared in numbers that matched the convoy math and amphibious plans ahead. Oilers, ammunition ships, repair tenders, and the floating workshops of Service Squadron 10 turned underway replenishment into routine. The logistic fleet train that sustained fast carriers across the breadth of the Pacific was a technical innovation, but it was also a political choice. to spend scarce steel on dull ships because the legal and moral case for the war made endurance, not spectacle, the governing metric. Air power followed the same arc. The Army Air Forces widened flying training and instrument instruction. The civilian pilot training program, born before the war, poured candidates into the expanded pipeline. Engine plants chased metallurgy that could live at higher temperatures and deliver reliable horsepower. Propeller and airframe shops multiplied lines and shared tooling through industry councils. Radar moved from laboratory and limited field deployment to widespread use. The proximity fuze, guarded by secrecy and often explained to the public only in metaphors, began to reach shipboard mounts and then anti-aircraft batteries ashore, altering the calculus of defense against fast-moving aircraft. The speech's logic-lawful response to a planned assault made secrecy and priority politically tolerable. Voters did not need circuit diagrams. They needed to believe that hidden work answered a plain wrong. The Homefront's conversion had a social dimension that the address made easier to manage. Roosevelt's tone-condemning acts, rather than people's left room to recruit a multi-ethnic, multi-regional workforce around tasks. The Fair Employment Practice Committee, created by executive order in 1941, gained new relevance as defense plants searched for labor. Women entered heavy industry in unprecedented numbers. Training programs compressed skill acquisition into weeks. 3-shift schedules became standard. The National War Labor Board tried to cap strikes while preserving union status. The War Labor Board's cases were argued in the language of necessity that Foreman had absorbed from the first 2 paragraphs of the address. Safety rules hardened, accident rates were tracked as matters of national efficiency rather than local misfortune. Statistical quality control. Once the province of a few specialists migrated into broader use because defects now carried a strategic cost. These disciplines were easier to sell because the nation had been invited on December 8th to think of public life in terms of sequence: date, facts, inference, action. Methods fit that habit of mind better than slogans. At the level of finance, the speech's clarity underwrote treasury programs. War bonds were sold not as charity, but as participation in a legal cause. The Treasury could ladder maturities and set rates that balanced inflation control against patriotic demand because the product had meaning, a receipt in a citizen's drawer tied to a known date and a declared condition. Congress, emboldened by the country's acceptance of the legal frame, passed revenue measures that broadened the tax base and increased rates. The line from the opening sentence to a withholding table is long and full of committee marks, but the political psychology connects. If hostilities exist, regularity in finance is part of the war effort. If the cause is lawful, then paying for it becomes a civic duty rather than a partisan quarrel. Diplomacy and grand strategy benefited from the same economy of words. The Arcadia Conference convened in Washington before the end of December 1941 and ran into January 1942, establishing the combined chiefs of staff and the strategic principle that Germany would be the primary enemy even as the United States fought in the Pacific from the first day. The declaration by United Nations on January 1, 1942, turned an Anglo-American partnership into a wider coalition. The December 8th address had not promised anything about theaters and timelines. It had promised a lawful war to a victory measured by restoration of security. That left military professionals room to argue over means without reopening the question of ends. It reassured allies that American politics would not wobble under pressure. It told Americans that the details, which would necessarily be complicated, would still hang from a simple hook. The speech also provided a public way to think about secrecy and the invisible parts of war. The December 7 timeline of the Japanese memorandum, the intelligence failures and confusions surrounding the attack, and the president's emphasis on planning helped sell expanded funding for code-breaking and traffic analysis at OP-20G in Washington and Station Hypo in Hawaii. When naval aviators found themselves guided by intelligence toward Coral Sea and Midway, ordinary Americans did not have to be told how the sausage was made. They had been told how the enemy behaved. In that framing, secret programs were not exotic. They were fitting replies to a recorded deception. The address's insistence that the infamous date would live had administrative consequences. To make an event live in public memory, institutions had to become better at remembering. Casualty reporting improved. Production figures left internal ledgers for public dashboards. The War Production Board's monthly tables became part of the press. Governors and mayors could point to numbers when asking citizens to accept ration books and blackouts. The loop words to plans, plans to numbers, numbers back to words, closed surprisingly fast. War bond drives did not just wave flags, they pointed at ship launchings and airframe totals. Newsreels showed conveyors and riveters not as curiosities, but as sections of a continuous sentence begun on December 8th. The country also took steps that diverged from the tone of the address. The mass removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans, ordered in February 1942, grew from fear, racism, and military caution. Roosevelt's speech had condemned government acts, not people's, yet agencies and commanders soon pushed policies that treated ancestry as risk. Historians read that divergence as a measure of the limits of rhetoric in the face of anxiety, and as a reminder that the mobilizing grammar record, infer, act, can be bent by bad premises. Still, the larger pattern set by the speech held in other domains. Elections took place on schedule, courts remained open, Congress debated and sometimes denied executive requests. Newspapers criticized with involuntary censorship rules. The country mobilized hard without abandoning the skeleton of its civic habits. If one follows the speech into factories and depots, the influence shows up in mundane places. Procurement officers learned to write shorter requests that climbed priority ladders faster. Plant managers adopted standard paragraphs that explained to workers why a line was shutting down for conversion or why a machine tool shipment had been diverted to another state. Training films emphasized procedure over drama, mirroring the address's rejection of ornament in favor of sequence. Inspection stamps and acceptance tags proliferated. Machine shop bulletin boards carried throughput charts with little patriotic art because the numbers themselves had a patriotic charge. They were the visible answer to the first sentence of the speech. Naval logistics deserve separate attention because they illustrate how a legal and rhetorical frame turns into hulls and habits. Before the war, at-sea replenishment existed, but was not the backbone of operations. After December 8th, the fleet had to be mobile at speeds and distances implied by the map list in the address. Oilers, ammunition ships, and repair vessels were not glamorous. They were essential if carriers were to keep striking forward bases and interdicting traffic rather than shuttling back to fixed depots. Ulithi Atoll would become the floating city of late war, but the choice to invest in its floating infrastructure began with orders placed when the nation was still grieving. Service squadron, TENS tenders, floating dry docks, and machine shops gave commanders freedom on timelines that matched the strategic map the president had sketched with words. The dull inventory of valves, pumps, and gasket material became a kind of battle plan written in parts lists. Education and training systems scaled under the same discipline. The Navy's V-12 College Training Program and the Army Specialized Training Program widened the pipeline for technical specialties. Gunnery and damage control schools rewrote curricula in the light of Pearl Harbor's fires. Pilot training multiplied across airfields that only months earlier had been sleepy municipal strips. Instructors adopted a tone that sounded like the speech, spare, procedural, explicit about cause and effect. Rhetoric did not make a machinist precise or a gunner cool under fire, but it kept the organization honest about what it was trying to achieve and why. From a historian's angle, the address repaid attention in three ways that go beyond its famous line. First, it offered a working model of how to speak in a crisis to a large, diverse democratic audience without either overselling or underinforming. The model's elements were visible and copyable: timestamp, facts, inference, lawful request, limited promise. Second, it created a political asset called predictability. Agencies, allies, corporations, unions, local governments, all could plan against the expectation that the federal government would continue to speak and act in that cadence. Third, it compressed the moral case for war into a form that did not need constant rehearsal. The public could be spared endless reiterations of grievance. It could be given instead a stream of instructions and explanations that were legible because the origin had been made clear once and for all. Consider how this predictability played out in the Treasury's bond drives and the revenue bills of 1942-1943. The broadened tax base and new withholding practices demanded administrative complexity and political sell-through. They were easier to pass and to administer in a country that could understand them as extensions of an already accepted chain of reasoning. Likewise, price controls and rationing, deeply unpopular in the abstract, were moored to the proposition that hostilities existed and that choices about tires, gasoline, and meat were, for a time, matters of national security. The poster art and radio spots drew their urgency from a shared memory of a morning and from the knowledge that Congress had acted in the same hour as the speech. The address also flattened some old bureaucratic rivalries. The War and Navy departments had long-standing differences over procurement methods, priority systems, and doctrine. The creation of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Combined Chiefs did not abolish these, but the public clarity about ends forced faster compromises over means. The signal virtue of the speech in this sphere was its refusal to be a program. It was a warrant. Programs can be debated. Warrants are either honored or dishonored. As long as the warrant held in other words, as long as the country remembered the date and accepted the inference, subordinate disagreements could be resolved without paralyzing the system. In industry, the address's shortness invited imitation. Managers learned that the most effective memos in wartime resembled Roosevelt's speech: one page, clear verbs, a beginning anchored to an observable fact, and an explicit ask. This habit leaked into labor management relations. Grievances and counter-grievances still accumulated, but the prevailing voice in settlements was procedural rather than theatrical. If hostilities exist, get to the part where you assign a tool, a shift, or a budget line. That is not poetry. It is a cultural shift that reduces friction, and friction reduction is a form of capacity. There was also a technical echo in how the nation learned to measure itself. The speech's confidence that the date would live encouraged quantification. If this is to be remembered, let it be remembered in tables as well as in words. By 1943, production dashboards circulated beyond cabinet rooms. Newspapers printed bar charts of planes, tanks, and ships. Bond drives published running totals. Factories posted defect rates and throughput. These practices are often credited solely to managerial modernity, but they needed a receptive public. The public had been trained, gently, by an address that treated them as adults, capable of following a chain of reasoning from first cause to daily work. Strategically, the economy of Roosevelt's words provided resilience. Early defeats and scares, the fall of the Philippines, the loss of Singapore, U-boats in the Atlantic, did not force Washington to re-justify the war every week. The cause had been stated, the method right joined to might had been promised. The rest was execution and learning. Victory's Doolittle's Raid, Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal could be inserted into the same frame without inflation. The country could see them as steps in a chain rather than as lurches between despair and euphoria. That mental stability mattered for bond markets, for enlistment, for labor discipline, and for alliance diplomacy. It is tempting to say that an address of a few minutes could not possibly carry so much. But in a mass media system built around radio and front pages, compressive clarity had unusual power. The speech was replayed, quoted whole, and reprinted verbatim. It did not lend itself to partisan slicing because there were no loose clauses to pull. Foreign audiences, friend and foe, could translate it without losing the point. The Japanese government's propagandists faced a problem. Brevity and coherence are harder to caricature than bombast. British editors, by contrast, could align their own explanations with an American text that read like a legal finding. As months turned into years, a nation that had learned on December 8th to connect calendar time to civic duty grew used to thinking this way. The date appeared on bond posters. The phrase, "Remember," anchored recruitment talk. The habit of tying a request to a fact-disciplined public communications even outside the war sphere. Roosevelt's later speeches varied in tone and ambition, but the December 8th template timestamp, facts, inference, lawful ask, limited promise, remained a touchstone. It was not just a way of talking about war. It was a way of running a vast enterprise without losing the people whose labor made it possible. From an institutional point of view, the address's most durable legacy may have been the synchronization of clocks. Before it, agencies and industries had been preparing on different schedules, with different assumptions about how fast they would have to move and how much authority they would get. After it, the argument for speed, centralization where necessary, and deference to priority became easier to win. The Office of Scientific Research and Development could place project orders with the confidence that secrecy and long lead times would not be political liabilities. The Warshipping Administration could redirect hulls and crews with less fear of congressional blowback. The War Production Board could shut down civilian lines that no longer made sense. And the Office of Price Administration could absorb public anger over ration books, because both could point back to a predicate that ordinary citizens still carried in their heads. The Navy's submarine campaign against Japanese shipping is a final case where the speech's structure mattered. A war defined by deliberate simultaneous attacks justified a logistics-first target set, and the results were decisive. By the end of the war, American submarines had sunk more than half of the Japanese merchant tonnage lost, choking coal, oil, raw materials, and food traffic. That strategic choice, made in the first days and hardened across 1942, rested on the idea that the enemy had made war a fact. Therefore, starving the machinery of that war was both lawful and necessary. The campaign's brutal arithmetic tonnage sunk, boats lost, crews rotated, became part of the same national sentence that began with the date. It was not pretty, but it was coherent, and coherence is a resource in war. The last test of the address's usefulness is what happened after victory. Demobilization, reconversion, and the reckoning with wartime decisions all required a public that could separate means from ends and hold leaders to account for both. The country did not keep emergency powers a day longer than it had to. Rationing ended, price controls fell. Agencies dissolved or shrank. Elections moved on. Historians often point to institutional inertia as the great danger of wartime mobilization. In the American case, a speech that had begun with a date and an injury made it easier to end special measures when the injury had been answered. The same clarity that enabled escalation enabled restraint. From first sentence to final promise, the address worked because it made a complicated future usable in the present. It taught people how to listen for sequence and how to translate sequence into work. It made law sound like action and action sound like law. It synchronized a Congress that could vote, a cabinet that could reorganize, admirals and generals who could assign missions, governors and mayors who could post guards and paint curbs, managers who could retool lines, workers who could switch shifts, teachers who could teach new subjects, inspectors who could learn to love a logbook, and families who could buy a bond and feel that a signature was a kind of enlistment. If the country became, as Roosevelt had promised a year earlier, an arsenal of democracy, it is because on the morning after Pearl Harbor, the arsenal was given a key that fit every lock. Mark the date, list the facts, draw the inference, make the lawful ask, and pledge victory by right joined to might.